Oxford lay beneath a thin veil of snow, the rooftops softened, the spires blurred into the pewter sky as if the city had grown shy of its own beauty. I had chosen the lounge of the Randolph that afternoon not for warmth, though the fire gave it willingly enough, but for the muffled quiet one rarely finds in the city on Christmas Eve. A few guests kept to their corners. Their murmurs were swallowed by the low hum of a carol service drifting from a radio in the far alcove. Glenfiddich in hand, I let the music wrap around me without quite listening, until the familiar Latin refrains began to draw me back to a memory I had long since tried to file under the irrelevant. I was 21 then, in Germany, the snow heavier, the air sharp enough to taste. There had been a church in the small town outside our barracks. I went in, more from the pull of the music than from faith, and stood in the back while a candle-lit choir sang to people who were not thinking of soldiers at all. I had understood almost none of the words, but something in the way the music rose and fell, that intimate sorrow that lives in minor keys, stayed with me far longer than the army ever did. The hotel's lounge smelt faintly of varnish and the dull sweetness of overwatered poinsettias. A man to my right, grey suit, pale hair neatly parted, sat with a folded copy of the Times. He had the air of one who performs all his habits with careful precision. Between sips of coffee, he spoke to no one in particular. Funny thing, you'd expect him to be there for Christmas Eve. Then the quiet laugh of a man who had already decided not to explain himself, and the rustle of the newspaper as he returned to it. I kept my gaze on the fire, though my mind reached for the remark as a terrier might worry at a glove. Expectation is a curious thing. You can expect rain in November, a bill in January, but when it comes to people, expectation has teeth. Whoever him was, he had apparently failed to be somewhere he ought to have been. The precise tone of the man's voice, neither wounded nor amused, suggested absence not by accident but by intention. Outside, a horse-drawn carriage passed, its wheels whispering over the snow. A small group of Japanese tourists hurried past the hotel entrance, collars up, their chatter bright against the greyness. I drained the last of my whiskey. The warmth reached my throat but left my hands cold. There was a crossword open on the table beside me, abandoned by some earlier guest. A glance showed it nearly complete. 4 down. A hymn, 5 letters, ending in E. I filled it in without thinking. Carol. The word's neat enclosure on the page made the radio's music feel less accidental, as if both the puzzle and the service were conspiring to point me towards something I hadn't yet seen. The man in the grey suit folded his paper and left. He did not look at me, though I noticed he placed the bill on the table with exact change. No. Gratuity! His footsteps were even, unhurried, until the revolving door took him. Snow began to fall again in the street, light at first, then thickening into a slow white curtain. The choir's voices lifted in the last verse of In Dulci Jubilo, each note lingering a fraction too long, as though reluctant to let the year go. I thought again of Germany, the strange loneliness of that Christmas, and the face of a fellow soldier who had once said, with the cheerful fatalism of the young, that absence is only noticed by those who care to see it. When the music ended, I stood. My coat smelled faintly of rain from the morning. Outside, the air carried the peculiar quiet that snow lends a city. The remark still sat in my mind, quietly displacing the carol, waiting, as all unclaimed facts do, for the moment it would fit. The snow had deepened overnight, the kind that swallows sound and makes every step feel like an intrusion. Lewis and I moved slowly through the cloisters of St. Anselm's, the air thick with the scent of damp stone. The college was a different creature in winter, the tourist chatter gone, the echo of our boots travelling the length of arcades once built for silence. The great iron gates had been closed since the previous evening. Not locked, tradition forbade it, but the road beyond was buried enough to keep anyone from leaving without considerable determination. It meant that, whoever had ended Frobisher's life, they were still here, somewhere within these walls. We found Eleanor Mayhew in her office, which was warm enough to suggest a private understanding with the bursarial budget. She received us with a calm that seemed rehearsed. Her voice, precise and well-tempered, told us of timetables, budgets, and the inevitable chaos of keeping a medieval institution solvent. She spoke of Frobisher as one might speak of a trusted yet tiresome colleague, essential to the fabric of the place, but prone to fraying at the edges. I noticed how carefully she kept her gaze on the ledgers in front of her, as though the columns of numbers could act as a defence. Giles Pembroke, in contrast, was all warmth and ease. We met him in the senior common room, where the fire burned low and the sherry decanter had been left to fend for itself. He was young for a fellow, ambitious, the sort who looked at an empty post as an opportunity rather than a loss. Frobisher, he said, had been a man of exacting standards, sometimes to the detriment of morale. A wry smile accompanied the words, but it faltered when I asked where he had been during the rehearsal. In his rooms, marking essays, alone. Mrs. Hartley was in the chapel polishing candlesticks with the determined air of someone who could remove tarnish from anything, metal, rumour or memory. She had been here for over 30 years, and it showed in the way she moved through the building, as if it were an extension of herself. She spoke of Frobisher without hesitation, describing him as a man who demanded perfection but rewarded it with kindness. Yet there was a stillness in her face when I mentioned the timing of his death, as though she had anticipated the question long before I asked it. We found Thomas Brierly in the music practice room, his fingers hovering over the piano keys without pressing them. A thin boy, eyes too old for his age. He told us haltingly that Frobisher had been both a mentor and a burden. The man's attention was a weight, flattering until it became oppressive. His alibi was the simplest. In his rooms, reading. No one had seen him there. It struck me, as we walked the snow-padded quadrangle again, that each of them had offered Frobisher the same curious blend of respect and resentment. Not the common dislike that breeds in the shadow of authority, but something more complicated, the recognition of a man whose virtues and flaws were woven too tightly to be separated. Lewis commented on the snow, how it had trapped them together like characters in one of those novels, where the murderer is inevitably revealed over port and candlelight. I told him it was the sort of weather that preserved things. Footprints, scents, secrets, and somewhere in the whiteness, I thought, was the shape of what had happened in that choir loft, waiting for the thaw. The college bell sounded the hour, the sound muffled by the snow as if the air itself were reluctant to disturb the stillness. We turned back towards the lodge, our breath hanging in the cold, and I found myself thinking of Frobisher's face, not in death, but in the photograph from last year's choir programme. The expression there was neither joy nor pride, but something else entirely, the look of a man who knew he was being watched and had decided to play along. The senior common room at St. Anselm's has never been a place for cheer. Even in December, with the snow pressing against its mullioned windows, it felt less like a refuge than an antechamber to some larger, more patient cold. The fire struggled on, as though embarrassed to be noticed, and the sherry decanter sat at the centre table, flanked by a dwindling platoon of mismatched glasses. Pembroke was there, legs crossed in the low armchair by the hearth. He greeted me with the easy familiarity of a man who has yet to be told no often enough in life. We spoke idly, the snow, the delayed post, the inconvenience of being trapped among colleagues. At some point, the carol service on the wireless, the SCR's only concession to festivity, shifted to a piece from the 17th century. Pembroke hummed along for a bar or two, then murmured a line, getting it wrong by a single significant word. I told him so, not sharply, but with the sort of pedantic pleasure I have never quite managed to suppress. His smile thinned, just perceptibly, before returning to its former shape. He agreed, of course, and poured himself more sherry, but the look had already registered with me. Annoyance sits oddly on certain faces. It clings. Later, in the choir office, the smell of paper and dust was so dense it might have been visible in the air. Frobisher's music scores lay in careful stacks, each tied with string. I loosened the bundle marked for the Christmas service and found his copy of In the Bleak Midwinter. The margins were neat, save for one, where the steady hand had become uncharacteristically hurried. A line of capital letters ran down the page's edge. Not words, at least not in any language that revealed itself immediately. I traced them with a finger, as though contact might yield meaning. They looked less like a casual note than a private code, the sort one might use to keep a thought from casual readers. I closed the book, the phrase from the crossword, "Cold comfort for lost kings," sliding back into my mind with the persistence of a half-remembered debt. I had seen it somewhere recently, not as a clue, but as part of something larger. Perhaps in a book, perhaps in a conversation. Such things tend to wait, circling just beyond reach until you stop chasing them. In the corridor outside, the evening light was thinning, turning the snow to a soft grey. The choir loft above the chapel would be empty now. The echo of Frobisher's last rehearsal still seemed to cling to its beams. I thought of Pembroke's flicker of annoyance, the care in Frobisher's annotations, and the peculiar fact that the music of a season meant to warm the heart was so often written in minor keys. Lewis found me there a few minutes later, asking if I'd eaten. I told him I wasn't hungry. It was true enough, though not for the reason he imagined. Hunger comes in many shapes, and mine was for something more than food, for the line that connected a misquoted carol to a string of lonely letters in the margin of a winter hymn. Eleanor Mayhew's office looked as though it had been arranged for a portrait, every book aligned, every sheet of paper stacked as if its corners had been squared with a set square. The snowlight from the tall window made her hair seem whiter than it was, and her hands rested on the desk in a pose too still to be entirely natural. She admitted, without the faintest hesitation, that she had seen Frobisher on Christmas Eve afternoon. It had been, she said, a meeting about budget allocations. The choir, in her view, had grown into a kind of gilded expense. Costly scores, visiting soloists, heating for rehearsals. Frobisher disagreed. Voices, he told her, were worth more than ledgers. She had smiled as she repeated the line, though it was unclear whether in fondness or irritation. It would have been easy to leave it at that, a routine quarrel in an institution that thrives on them, but something in her tone suggested a history not entirely financial. Over the years I've learned that people often speak about money when they mean something else altogether. It was Lewis, with his unshowy diligence, who found the rest. He had been in the archives, tracing Frobisher's professional appointments, and came across a concert programme from the early 1980s. Eleanor Mayhew, listed as soprano soloist. A promising career, abruptly absent from the record a few years later. No reviews after 1985, no new appointments. When I mentioned it to her, she did not deny it. She had sung, yes, until a vocal injury had made performance impossible. She gave the phrase the dry, technical inflection of someone who had repeated it often enough to dull its edge. I asked whether Frobisher had known her in those days. She paused, the silence faintly theatrical, and said he had accompanied her once, long ago, at a Christmas recital. I let the pause stretch, then asked if that was their only meeting until she came to St. Anselm's. A faint smile. Almost. In her desk drawer, under the inevitable tide of invoices and committee minutes, I found an envelope without a name. Inside, a single sheet of cream paper. The handwriting was elegant, the ink slightly faded. We all have our parts to play until the last note fades. No date, no signature. I showed it to her. She looked at it for a long moment, then returned it to me without comment, as if it were mine to keep. The remark could have been metaphor or warning, affection or threat. In the theatre of suspicion, such lines are the perfect props. Lewis naturally began to wonder aloud about revenge. A ruined career, a man who had once been part of it, a long memory sharpened by proximity. It would have fitted neatly, like a well-cut piece in a jigsaw. But the trouble with neatness is that it so often announces itself. True motives rarely fit so tidily into the spaces we expect. When we left her office, the quadrangle lay white and undisturbed. I thought of the unsigned letter, the long-ago recital, the woman who spoke of budgets but looked at snow as though it might sing back to her. The elements were there for a certain kind of story, the sort juries and newspaper columns like best. But something in me resisted it. As we walked away, Lewis asked if I thought she had done it. I told him the truth, that the line in the letter was the sort of thing that stayed with a man. But so was a false trail, if it was laid with care. It was Lewis who found it, though he swore he might have stepped past it. Had the wind not lifted the snow just enough to catch the edge of the paper? We were crossing the chapel courtyard when he bent down, brushed away the thin drift, and pulled free a photograph stiffened by cold. The corner had curled, and the image was half obscured by ice crystals, but even before I saw the faces, I felt a quiet shift in the air. the sense that we had stumbled on something the present had tried to forget. The photograph was black and white, slightly blurred with age. A group of men and women stood on the chapel steps, their winter coats buttoned high, expressions caught between formality and the cheer of some occasion. Frobisher was there, 25, perhaps 30 years younger, the hair darker, the jaw less certain. Beside him, to my mild surprise, was a much younger Giles Pembroke, the smugness already present but softened by youth. And there, a step lower, stood a man I recognised from a portrait in the lodge corridor, Mrs. Hartley's husband, who had died some years back. His face had the sort of untroubled openness that seems almost careless when viewed in retrospect. I wondered if his wife had ever walked past that photograph without feeling its weight. In the bottom corner, faint but legible, someone had written Noel 1974. The ink had faded into a shade between grey and brown, like words overheard from another room. One face, however, would tell us nothing. The paper had been torn there, not by accident, but with that slow, deliberate pressure that makes destruction part of the message. The missing fragment had taken most of a man's features with it, leaving only the faint suggestion of a collar and the slope of a shoulder. I turned the photograph over. Blank. No names, no notes. Whoever had owned it had relied on memory, and perhaps that was the point, a record not for strangers but for someone who already knew the story. We took it to the porter's lodge, where the old gas heater clanged its way towards warmth. The porter, who had been at the college for 4 decades, peered at it and nodded. Oh yes, that was the Christmas do, years back. Bit of a strange one that year. He could remember the snow being worse than this, and someone missing from the supper. Who? He frowned. Funny, he said, but he couldn't quite recall. I carried it with me for the rest of the afternoon. The image was like a chord played softly but insistently in the background. Something in it suggested that whatever had brought us to the choir loft on Christmas Eve was not born of this winter's quarrels over budgets or performances. It had the feel of a much older composition, one whose melody had been building quietly for decades. By the time I left the porter's lodge, snow had begun to drift in the corners of the cloisters, filling them with the hush of a cathedral. I looked again at Frobisher's younger face. There was nothing in it of the man slumped in the choir loft, except perhaps the same faint turn of the eyes, as if even in company he was measuring the distance to some private horizon. The torn face troubled me most. People rarely rip photographs for no reason. It is an act of erasure, but also of confession, a sign that something once looked at with recognition can no longer be borne. That night, alone in my rooms, I placed the photograph on the desk beside the crossword I had abandoned earlier. The clue that had followed me since Christmas Eve, cold comfort for lost kings, seemed to breathe differently now, as though it too had been waiting for this image to appear. I could not yet see how they were linked, but the sense was growing in me that when the connection came, it would not be with the neatness of a budget dispute or a petty rivalry. It would come like an old song returning to its refrain, one you realize you have been hearing under your breath for years. He arrived in the middle of the afternoon when the snow had thinned to a slow, wet drift, and the lodge smelled of damp wool. I heard his voice before I saw him, loud, hoarse, with the slurred urgency of a man who has decided that truth will be louder if it is shouted. Lewis was already there, holding himself in that careful, patient way he has when the person opposite him is trying to pick a fight. The man was tall but stooped, a heavy coat hanging from his shoulders as though he had forgotten to fasten it. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin at the corners raw from cold and drink. Thomas Brierly's father. He said the name as if it were a flag to be planted. The college, he told us, had driven his boy too hard. Music every night, exams in the morning, the endless pressure to perform. And Frobisher, the name came out thick, bitter, had been the worst of them. Lewis tried to quieten him, but the words spilled faster. Years ago, he said, he had gone to the police, told them Frobisher's attention to the boys wasn't right, told them something needed to be done. Nothing came of it. The file was closed, if it had ever been opened, and now Frobisher was dead, and perhaps, he added with an ugly twist of the mouth, the world was better for it. There was a moment when the lodge seemed smaller, the air tighter. The accusation in its bare shape was damning enough. I watched him, the way his eyes roamed as he spoke, never quite holding still on either of us. Drunk, yes, but there was more than alcohol blurring the edges. I asked him where he had been on Christmas Eve. He laughed, a dry, splintered sound. In the King's Arms until closing, then home. No one to vouch for him. His voice hardened again, circling back to his son, the pressures, the rehearsals, the impossible standards. When he left, slamming the lodge door behind him, the air in the room felt abruptly calmer, though not cleaner. Lewis stood by the desk, hands in his pockets, looking troubled. "It's enough to put him at the top of the list," he said. "Perhaps." The trouble was, I could not reconcile the man's tone, raw, scattered, driven by grievance, with the strange precision of that choir loft scene. Frobisher's body had been placed with an almost ceremonial care, as though the killer wanted the discovery to have meaning beyond the fact of death. This man's anger was too blunt for such choreography. Outside, the snow had begun to melt into a pale slush along the edges of the quadrangle. I walked its perimeter alone, the echo of the father's voice still in my head. Accusations are rarely free of motive, and some motives are born in shadows so deep they distort the very shape of truth. By the time I reached the far cloister, the crossword, clue was back, cold comfort for lost kings. It seemed to follow me like a refrain. I knew it came from somewhere else, somewhere older than any newspaper puzzle. The phrase had the weight of something remembered rather than invented, a shard of an older text. I stood for a moment in the snow's thin hush, the chapel's roofline dark against the clouded sky, and thought of Frobisher's life, the younger man in the photograph, the choirmaster's marked scores, the missing face torn from the past. The father's story might have been true. It might even have been the whole truth as he saw it. But something told me the path to that choir loft ran a longer, colder way than grievance alone could take us. The college library always smelled faintly of beeswax and dust, a fragrance that never quite settled into comfort. In the far alcove, where the light was always a shade dimmer, the hymnals sat in neat ranks. I'd been leafing through them for the better part of an hour, the repetition almost soothing. Then, in Frobisher's personal copy, bound in worn green leather, initials faintly embossed, the pattern broke. The second verse of In the Bleak Midwinter was gone, not torn crudely, but cut cleanly, with the neatness of someone who knew how to use a blade without fraying the paper. In its place, a slip of cream paper, folded once, slid precisely between the pages. I opened it. The ink had bled slightly into the fibres, but the hand was elegant, deliberate. Cold comfort for friends without faith. Shakespeare, Henry VI. I knew the line, not a common quotation, the sort of thing chosen by someone with a mind for obscure echoes. It was close enough to the crossword clue to set the back of my neck tingling. Cold comfort for lost kings, friends without faith, not identical, but sharing the same skeleton. Someone had meant me, or someone, to see the connection. Lewis appeared at the edge of the aisle carrying 2 cardboard archive boxes and looking faintly victorious. From the basement, buried behind the Christmas decorations, he said, "We found a table between the shelves where the dust lay thicker and began to go through the contents. Old recital programs, photographs with curling edges, ledgers of donations and bequests. In the second box, tucked into an unmarked folder, was a will. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded in places, but the heading was still legible. The name at the top belonged to a man I recognized from the older portraits in the hall, Geoffrey Armitage, once the college organist, dead these 30 years. The will was peculiar. The main beneficiaries were distant cousins, but in the margin, in a hand not matching the body of the text, someone had altered a bequest, a set of antique hymnals, originally meant for the college, redirected to My Dear Friend F. And there, on the second page, under the line for witnesses, was the name, J. Frobisher. Doesn't say when it was changed, Lewis murmured. No, I said, but it does tell us something about who Frobisher knew and how far back. The handwriting of the alteration was precise, but its ink was darker than the rest, newer, though still decades old. I could not yet see why anyone would hide this, but the concealment suggested significance. I turned the page again, looking for other changes. At the bottom, in the same dark ink, was a half-finished line, "And let the song remain, though the singer falls silent." It was the kind of sentiment a musician might write, but also the kind of phrase that could be bent into something more deliberate, a message, a warning, even a justification. Lewis was already thinking ahead. So, connection to an old will and a missing verse in a hymn book. Both hidden, both careful. Whoever left these wanted them found, but not quickly. And, I said, both tie into language about loss, kings, friends, singers, words chosen not for comfort, but for weight. The library seemed colder as we replaced the boxes. Somewhere outside, the chapel bells struck 4, the chimes muffled by the falling snow. My mind was still on the hymn, on the absent verse, the one about angels and archangels, cherubim and seraphim, and a mother's kiss. It had been excised for a reason, and the replacement was a line about faith, or the lack of it. If Frobisher had kept that slip all these years, it was not just a matter of literary taste. It was a signal, perhaps, to someone else who shared the memory. The clue was not in the words alone, but in what had been removed to make room for them. When we left the library, I carried the hymn book under my arm. The snow was heavier now, the quadrangle nearly empty. Somewhere behind us the rows of hymnals stood unchanged, save for one gap. But in my hand was the absence, a missing verse, a stolen line, and the growing certainty that the story we were uncovering began long before Christmas Eve, long before the final note in the choir loft. The library was almost oppressively quiet, its high vaulted ceiling muffling even the faint hiss of snow against the leaded windows. Morse sat at the end of a long oak table, jacket draped loosely over the chair, a half-drained cup of lukewarm coffee beside him. Outside, the college quadrangle lay buried in white, footsteps half-filled by fresh snowfall, the paths no longer distinct from the lawns. On the table before him lay the small collection of objects that now formed his working universe. A photocopy of the torn photograph, the annotated music score, the altered hymn book, and a sheaf of Lewis's neatly written witness notes. Morse tapped his pen against the photograph as if the rhythm might conjure an answer. The suspect's words swirled through his mind again. Pembroke's deliberate, cultured voice. In the bleak midwinter, frost was made moan. Wrong. The carol didn't say that, and Pembroke had bristled at being corrected. Eleanor Mayhew, her dark eyes level and cold, admitting her meeting with Frobisher, but skirting neatly around the real subject, and Mrs. Hartley leaning slightly on her mop handle in the corridor, saying it as if it were nothing. He always liked the highest note. It was that phrase that had kept him awake last night, not just the words, but the faint tremor in her voice. He slid the photograph closer. The Christmas gathering, 1974, a younger Frobisher in a fur-lined academic gown, smiling stiffly at the camera. Pembroke, impossibly lean in a dark overcoat. Mrs. Hartley's late husband, square-shouldered and cheerful. And there, at the far left, the ragged tear where another face had once been. Morse took out a magnifying glass from his inside pocket and examined the frayed paper. The tear was old, the edges browned slightly, not recent vandalism. Whoever had done it had done so years ago, possibly at the moment the photograph was first stored away. Lewis entered quietly, carrying a file from the archives. "Found the register from 74, he said, placing it beside Morse. "There's no note of who was in that choir photo, but there's a list of soloists from the Christmas Eve concert." Morse scanned the names, and there it was, Jonathan Avery, tenor soloist, a name unmentioned by any of the suspects. "Highest note," Morse murmured, almost to himself. Lewis frowned. "You think Mrs. Hartley was talking about this Avery?" "I think she was talking about a voice," Morse said, leaning back. "A tenor's voice. And I think Avery's absence from the photograph is not accidental. That's the torn-away face." Lewis nodded slowly. "What happened to him?" Morse tapped the register with the end of his pen. "That, Lewis, is the question. If my memory serves, Avery's death was recorded as a drowning in the Cherwell on Boxing Day, 1974. But a promising tenor doesn't just vanish from history unless someone wants him gone." The snow outside seemed to press harder against the glass, muting the daylight. Morse lit a cigarette, ignoring the librarian's faint look of disapproval from behind the desk. "And where does Frobisher fit into this?" Lewis asked. "Front and centre," Morse replied. He was organist then, and more than that, a man who prized perfection in his performances. Perhaps too much. Something happened that Christmas, something that tied Frobisher, Avery, and at least one of our suspects together in a way they couldn't escape. Morse's eyes drifted to the crossword clue he'd scrawled on a scrap of paper. Cold Comfort for Lost Kings. He took the hymn book from the pile and ran a finger over the jagged edge where the second verse had been cut. Cold comfort for friends without faith. Shakespeare, yes, but also a message. Lost kings, he said softly, or lost voices. Lewis looked puzzled. You mean Avery? Exactly. Someone cut him out from the photograph, from memory, perhaps from life itself. And now, after all these years, Frobisher ends up dead. Not in a moment of passion, but with a neatness that suggests rehearsal, a conductor's precision. The clock above the fireplace ticked in the heavy silence. Morse stubbed out his cigarette, eyes narrowing. I think, he said slowly, it's time we stopped looking at this as a crime of the present and started treating it as an encore to something played 40 years ago. Lewis gave a small nod. Which means, my dear Lewis, Morse said, rising and gathering the photograph, we have a ghost in this snowbound college, and it's high time we asked the right person why Jonathan Avery's face was torn away. He paused at the library door, glancing back once at the snowy quadrangle beyond the windows, a stage awaiting its final act. The snow outside had thickened to a silent, impenetrable wall, muting the sound of the college bells. The choir loft was lit only by a few low lamps, their yellow glow falling across the carved oak stalls. Breath misted in the cold air as Morse stood before the gathered faces. Eleanor Mayhew, pale but defiant, Giles Pembroke, restless in his chair, Thomas Brierly, hunched and anxious, and Mrs. Hartley, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes cast down. Lewis stood off to one side, watchful, his notebook closed. He had learned by now that when Morse called a meeting like this, the real evidence was not in the paper, but in the silences. Morse began without preamble. 48 hours ago, Julian Frobisher was found dead here, in the chapel, during one of the heaviest snowfalls Oxford has seen in years. At first, the motive seemed bound up in recent quarrels. Money, ambition, grudges. But the truth lay further back. Much further. He turned to the table, where the 1974 photograph lay under a sheet of protective plastic. His finger tapped the torn corner. This was taken during the Christmas term of that year. Frobisher, Pembroke, Mrs. Hartley's late husband. And here, in the missing section, a man whose name few of you have uttered in decades. David Hartley. Mrs. Hartley's gaze lifted, just enough for Morse to see the flicker of something. Pride, pain, and a kind of weary defiance. David Hartley was a gifted tenor, Morse went on, with a voice that could make even the dust motes tremble in the rafters. But he was also a man under pressure. He had failed his finals, and a scandal, both academic and personal, threatened to destroy him. On Christmas Eve 1974 he was found dead in his rooms. Officially, an accident. Unofficially. Morse paused, letting the air grow heavy. It was suicide. Pembroke shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her glass. Julian Frobisher, Morse continued, was one of the men who helped bury that truth. He was young, ambitious, eager to protect the college's reputation. He signed off on an account that removed all mention of disgrace. He even persuaded David's sister to let the matter rest. His eyes turned to Mrs. Hartley. But the matter never rested, did it? Her lips parted, but she said nothing. You waited, Morse said quietly. Years, decades. You became the keeper of the college's keys, the silent watcher in the corridors. And when the snow came down, when no one could come or go, you decided it was time. You knew Frobisher would drink mulled wine during rehearsal. You slipped in the poison while the sopranos were practicing upstairs. And then, when the music stopped, you arranged him in the choir stall, like an offering. Mrs. Hartley's eyes met his now, level and unflinching. He liked the highest note, she said, her voice calm. Said it was where the angels lived. I thought, perhaps now he'd find out. There was no triumph in her tone, only a kind of exhausted relief. Lewis stepped forward with quiet efficiency, the handcuffs glinting in the lamplight. As she rose, the distant sound of the choir began to filter in from the chapel, the trebles starting in the bleak midwinter, their voices carrying the melancholy of the season. Morse stood still, the high notes slicing cleanly through the cold air. Something caught in his chest, not guilt exactly, but the familiar ache of seeing too late the full measure of a life. Lewis led Mrs. Hartley away without a struggle. The others filed out in silence, leaving Morse alone in the loft. Snow pressed against the stained glass, muting the candlelight, and the choir sang on. Heaven cannot hold him, nor earth sustain. Heaven and earth shall flee away. Morse closed his eyes. Somewhere in the blend of treble and tenor, he thought he could hear a voice from 50 years ago, pure and unbroken, a ghost in the rafters. When the last note faded, he reached for his coat, the frost already creeping through the seams. Outside, the snow would cover every footprint before morning. Inside, the silence would hold until the bells called the next service, and the next name, to memory.